Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about empathy and technology. For once, I'm focusing on empathy specifically to hear evidence about what an extraordinary difference empathy can make across a multitude of different settings, personal and professional, and what ingenious methods there are now to help us all be more empathetic. I often get asked, can empathy be learned? Yes. And while it is a skill we are born with as human beings, and one that is seen as fundamental to human relationships, collaboration, and cooperation, we generally haven't been practicing it much in the workplace. So creating new empathy habits takes more effort, which is why I wrote a book to understand and support that process. At the same time, technology can support our being more empathetic or empathic in our interactions. Machine learning can recognize beneficial signals and behaviors and unhelpful patterns, allowing us to improve interactions. I'm thrilled to be speaking with Dr. Grin Lord, who is working on this specifically as the founder and CEO of empathic.ai, Empathy for Enterprise, and of Therapists in Tech, a collaborative of digital mental health experts. Dr. Lord was the Chief Clinical Officer at Listen.io, Clinical Product Psychologist at Ayupa.ai, and Research Scientist at University of Washington. Her areas of expertise include conversational design, using AI and machine learning to augment human connection, evidence-based therapies, health coaching, and psychology. Hi, Grin. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks.
You and I are both incredibly involved and passionate, I am assuming, about empathy, but you're coming at it from a very interesting angle, and I totally believe that technology can be incredibly helpful in helping us understand the signals that indicate empathy or helping us understand other people. Mm-hmm. So there's so much that I want to ask you about, but I start at the beginning. Why did you start off studying psychology and practicing it? And then you got into teaching it, or advising people about the businesses, if that's right. So how did that evolution happen?
Yes. So I'm a clinical psychologist and research scientist by training. And in the early 2000s, I actually worked here in Seattle at our level 1 county hospital, which is called Harborview Medical Center. And, healthcare is different all around the world. And what Harborview is our hospital where we take everyone regardless of insurance. And it's also the place where people go if they have an extreme accident, like a car accident, a burn, things like that. So it's our most intense hospital. And I started out working in the emergency department there. And I was part of a trial where we were having folks come in after a drunk driving accident, the people that perpetrated the accident. And we actually listened to them with empathy for 15 minutes, approximately, and saw how that did compared to treatment as usual, which is, typically people saying you need to go to AA or giving them pamphlets or whatever. And we found that the folks that got the empathy intervention had major drops in their drinking, and those effects held for 3 years and led to a 46% reduction in readmissions. So it saved Harborview millions of dollars to have people listening with empathy.
So just understanding why they had been in the situation they had, that it actually then caused an accident because of their drinking.
Yeah, so I think some of the key ingredients in these kind of listening interventions have to do with approaching people with non-judgment and curiosity and accurate listening and understanding like what they want to do with their lives next, and less about telling them what you think they should do. And so
Right.
when people use this kind of listening, it just had this profound impact. So we were asked to scale it to level one trauma centers nationally. And that was part of what I was recruited to do. Is I became a trainer and a coach, teaching medical students, teaching therapists, teaching doctors all across the country and how to do this.
Just going back to that from a non-clinical psychologist
Yeah,
point of view, it was not talking about the drinking at all because it
that's
was
right.
not assumed, but there was something underneath. The conversation was open in terms of, let's just understand you.
No, I think actually for that study, it was focused on drinking behaviors, but it was focused on
Mm,
talking about drinking with the key and primary ingredient being empathic listening. So
okay.
the folks that came into that conversation were not coming into that conversation with a particular outcome in mind that they
Hmm.
were like, I need this person to stop, or I need them to feel a
Mm,
certain way or to go. It was more like
got it.
curiosity around like,
Hmm.
how do you feel like right now? What was it like to come into the emergency room after this? Like, how are you, like a more exploratory conversation, but it did center
Mm,
on drinking because I mean, most of the time
sure.
that's what people
Okay.
wanted to talk about, not necessarily just like completely loose totally humanistic free form,
Right.
like free association.
Sure.
Like there was a point to the conversation. But what we were really doing was looking at, if you go in and you have those conversations and you add these empathic ingredients, how does that impact the conversation? If you have people that are non-judgmental, open,
Hmm.
accepting, aren't driving towards an agenda, aren't seeking
Hmm.
persuasion, don't want to give people pamphlets or have like a particular educational goal in
Or
mind, that
or
it's
trying to advise them, or
exactly, it's more about evoking the story from them and what's important to
right.
them around how they came to that point. But yeah, it wasn't like, let's have a free form conversation about your lunch.
So 15 minutes of empathetic conversation had that kind of result. Wow. So
Yep.
then you rolled it out across many more organizations.
That's right. So we scaled it nationally to all level one trauma centers, and it ended up saving around
Oh,
$2
wow.
billion a year, or continues to save $2 billion a year, to have people listen in this particular way. And so our hospital was one of the first to have this service. It was called I think they called it the recovery service, where they had psychologists
That's
deployed
amazing.
across the hospital to do this
Mm,
form of listening. And uh, and again, it's been used. These kind of techniques are used not just in emergency departments, but for many different forms of counseling when you're trying to
hmm.
um, approach behavior change through a lens of empathy, where accurate
Mm,
understanding is the most important thing. So when I was doing trainings, we started out by doing these workshops where I would lead 3-day workshops for folks like all across the country. I was doing like these circuits because there wasn't telehealth or anything at the time. And when we did that, we actually found that skill acquisition and empathy was really hard to train through a PowerPoint and through a workshop. And in fact, people
mm,
didn't learn much or change many of their behaviors, or they learned a lot. Like they learned about empathy,
hmm,
they learned about
hmm.
how to do this, but they couldn't do it or implement it in their lives. And I think we can kind of all relate to this. If you have to go to a training, and let's imagine it's riding a bike, you could watch PowerPoints all day on bike
Hmm.
riding, but until you're on the bike and doing it and like working with someone,
Right.
you can't say you can ride a bike. So like you have to do it, you have to
Right.
practice it.
What I do in my book is I get very practical and I have empathy habits. And I sort of say,
Yeah,
like, these are very specific habits. This is what you need to do to make it
exactly.
incredibly simple and practical.
So we found out, we actually did a randomized control trial, that these 3-day workshops, like this is not the formula for success. And
Mm,
skills, I'm not going to remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think skill acquisition dropped within 3 days and was basically
mm.
completely zero within months. But for some people, it was zero immediately after. So for the
Oh,
majority
wow.
of people
Okay.
attending these, like they could not put it into practice from a workshop. But it took us a long time to figure
Mm,
that out. So we moved into a coaching modality and listening to actual conversations and having people kind of know, these are the good things that you did in the conversation. Here's things that need work, playing back the
right.
conversation, pointing these things out, doing role plays, coaching. So then there's a research trial called the Clinical Trials Network, where we did this at scale across the US. And it was the largest coaching study, I think, that's been conducted to date, where we had providers actually recording their conversations and then having them listened to. And that worked. And we found that people did change behaviors, but it was incredibly latent. So, people were talking about a conversation they had 3 weeks ago. They're like, I think I remember that person. Thankfully, the behaviors were often the same. So we're coaching, it didn't really matter, but it didn't have that behavioral learning thing that you need, where almost like, like clicker training, like we have someone in the moment, like that's the skill. That element was missing, which we know from human behavior is so important to have like immediate feedback when you're doing something that you want to change.
Why do you think that is? Because empathy is natural to us. We haven't been using it in the workplace, which of course is my focus, but we do use it so much in our personal lives. So why is it so difficult to be introducing empathetic behavior in environments where we haven't been using it, or increasing the empathy that we're using in a particular situation? Is there a reason that you understand more, having just seen that it's much harder to instill new behaviors, new habits than you anticipated?
Yeah, it's interesting because, what we were training these providers to do was to optimize for like immediate objective perception of empathy, increased engagement, trust, and, building that relationship quickly. In order to do that, you actually have to follow some rules. Like we have figured out like the formula for accurate listening, and it's not natural to do that in everyday conversation. You would never with your friend, I mean, you probably should, but you would never with your friend sit back and not ask a single question for like 20 minutes and just kind of like listen intently and nod. Like you might.
Not for that long, no.
It's weird. Yeah. So we're training these providers to really like intensify things that would naturally occur in a relationship over time and with multiple exposures and rapport and longer relationships where you get a chance to do that. And then you have other times where you're talking and it's a reciprocal relationship. We're really saying like in this moment, you're going to become like a super empathic person and you're going to follow this strict set of rules. And it frankly isn't natural. Like it isn't something that you would normally do, but it has a profound effect.
Right. So this is the most intense way to get there, even though it's actually not natural. Okay. Got it.
But what I would say, and what I tell my friends and what I've told patients, is that actually doing this more intense way and being fairly strict about how you listen, it's like has an undeniable power. So even if you know someone's doing this, like these techniques with you, let's just take the techniques of asking open-ended questions and reflections and repeating back. Like you just do those two things in a conversation. Someone knows you're doing it and they're aware of it.
Right.
It's like undeniably powerful.
It still makes a difference.
It still works. So like, even if you're like,
she heard me. Oh yeah.
Like I feel so understood in this conversation, even though I know like this isn't how we would normally talk, to have this person be like not giving me any advice or any opinions or any disclosures about this. So it's not that it's, I think it's difficult to train because of that, focus on making sure that you do not, as a listener, deviate from these like set of rules. And you really have to practice that. There has to be some self-awareness into how you're doing that. And it's, it's things that like psychotherapists and coaches, they train years to be able to sit in a conversation and like adhere to those set of skills without being like, oh, I have this funny story over here. And like, here's my... whatever.
We all need more self-awareness anyway. So, right. So you were then finding this out. This was quite a while ago still, right?
Yeah, this is like early 2000s still. And so we worked with doing this like phone-based coaching. And then what eventually came up was like, this is a perfect candidate for machine learning models for computers to help us, because we have humans labeling all the good and bad things in these conversations and listening to them. Could we train a computer to recognize those same things using the data that the humans have done and to give that feedback instantly to those providers? Because again, it's not like we were following a coding or rating system that was a gut sense of like, do we like this person? We're like saying, do they do these skills? Are they like adhering to this? Are they doing, X, Y, or Z empathically?
Right. It's not reading the person. It's actually, has the provider been following these specific rules? Okay,
That's
got
right.
it. Okay.
Which is interesting in light of my current research, which focuses much more on the relationship between two people. At that time, it was very focused on like, how is this provider doing it, and not so much on ratings of like, how was that received, which I think was a problem for empathy research at that time. But that's what we really focused on. So we eventually did train computers to do this automatically. And 2009, we started a collaborative research project between University of Washington, USC, UC Irvine, eventually University of Utah, where we took speech signal processing and all of these natural language processing engineers, brought them in, talked to them about empathy, and produced basically a platform where you could upload a recording and it would automatically say, these are all the things you as the provider did. Here's like your empathic rating that is aligned with and has been trained on, tens of thousands of hours of listening to these conversations. And here's your report.
And so that's still evaluating the provider in terms of how well they have followed the direction. Still not evaluating the person on the other side yet. No. Okay.
So then later, I'm not quite sure when I published this. I think maybe it was like 2011, 2012. I started to look into synchrony, which is this concept of people starting to synchronize in their language style over time. There's a lot of different forms of synchrony. So people have studied what's called vocal entrainment, like how people start to go towards an average vocal tone in conversation, or verbal, visual synchrony, and like how you talk.
When I go to Scotland to visit my sister, I'm either chameleon or I'm very superficial, but I'd start saying, ugh, and I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. I love the Scottish accent, but I just do.
Right. So that's what I studied. And what I found, and I published research on this, is that highly empathic people synchronize. And it's typically the person that's in power in the conversation will synchronize. If they're being empathic, they'll synchronize it's not like a joint synchrony where we all get kind of like an average style. It would be you synchronize to your sister, or whoever that person is that in the moment, in our case, it would be a doctor, would synchronize to the patient as a form of empathy. And they would even synchronize in very subtle ways, like pauses in conversations where they would put adverbs, like the exact words and phrases they would use. And I found that measure of synchrony was more predictive of skill use. Like it was more predictive of objective ratings of empathy by outside raters than any skills used. So you could be using all of the right skills, and if you don't like that person across from you, you won't synchronize. If you don't want to really talk to them or get to know them, you won't synchronize, and it will be perceived as an unempathic interaction by the receiver and outside people, even if you're doing all the right things.
Because they will intuitively or whatever, viscerally recognize
like unconscious,
that. Fascinating.
Yeah. So we started to notice it's almost like a biomarker or a lie detector test is this synchrony.
Does this person like me or not? Are they synchronizing at all?
I mean, there's many different contexts. So that was when I first started to get interested in what are other ways that we can measure empathy outside of the skills being used, and kind of moved away from just this one model.
Question, as we're going forward and we're going into the workplace, because we aren't in the workplace yet.
Yes.
In terms of that going towards groupthink, because if everybody's syncing up in terms of how they talk and the words that they're using, I would kind of assume there may be some synchronization also of how people are thinking about things because of how they're expressing them. Maybe not, but put in that so that we can just think about that later in terms of how to adjust for that or what that could mean in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's a really fascinating topic. Yes, we can think about that, but that gets me going in a whole bunch of different ways. So I'll fast forward my timeline a bit. I basically had the revelation that maybe you're kind of getting to, which is why are we focusing so much in this clinical aspect? I mean, we know that there are improved treatment outcomes with empathy. We can see we save costs. Like there are all this massive impact for empathy in this one structure. And so I got to a point where I was like, I want to take this outside of the clinical space. Like, it's great that we can train therapists and doctors to do this, but why couldn't we train, well, frankly, anyone in these skills? Like you could listen to your colleagues in this way. You could listen to your friends in this way. Customer service reps could listen in this way.
Yes,
like managers, coaches, teachers, and anyone can listen with empathy. Like, yes, we have the data, we have the research, we know that this works. And in these particular intense environments, let's take it out of those environments and see how it works in other places. And professional coaches have already been doing that. Like that is a known body of research to be using some of these skills. And same thing actually in other elements of industrial organizational psychology and sales. Like people use a lot of these same kind of things. But this was the first time that I felt like, okay, we have real outcome data and research to back it up. It's not just a like lore of this is the kind of thing that works. And now we have a computer program that can do this automatically, that can detect these things at scale.
Fantastic.
So I started to kind of move towards the startup space and take these same automations, but apply them in new settings. And that's what I did with my current startup, Empathic.
You launched that. First of all, there's all this progression and moving out of the clinical space. But then also the pandemic happened and you launched this company in September 2020. I'm assuming there was some kind of connection potentially in terms of what you did, why you did it, and what it's focused on.
Exactly. So, well, the first impetus was me wanting to move out of the academic space. And I had already been working at University of Washington. I already had a startup. So I knew I wanted to create my own thing. And the pandemic hit, and I actually had moved to go work for a startup called Uper, which is a therapy chatbot, right around the time of the pandemic. And I was working with them to enhance their conversations, their chatbot conversations with empathy. But the thing about these particular ways of listening is that the most important ingredient in my mind for empathy is accurate understanding. And so for me, when I was working at Uber, I was really trying to have the bot express or have the user of the bot feel immediately understood. That was like the first interaction I wanted to have happen in those conversations, was to have the bot kind of repeat back what it understood was going on in a way where the user was like, oh my gosh, this thing is like, it gets me. And we managed to do that using AI, using these rules. And it had like profound impacts on conversion into the app, because people were like, oh, this thing is different than other bots I've talked to. Like it really gets me. And we even had users report things like they'd rather talk to the bot than a human because of how consistently non-judgmental it was, how many efforts it made to understand the user in a way that maybe they had not experienced before. So we had this wide reach in kind of getting this immediate experience of understanding.
That's fascinating, the way you actually phrase that in it, the bot, was unjudgmental, knowing that it's humans who are programming.
Yeah. Yeah, it's humans doing this. It is funny for it to be like...
The bot really understands me. You humans don't, but the bot understands me.
Yeah, but we made that bot.
No judgment about us as human beings. We have some evolving to do, perhaps. Okay, so the pandemic happened. You've been helping augment and improve this bot.
So I worked at Uber, and when I saw that massive improvement, when I was like, oh my gosh, this double conversion just by adding that, I was like, I think maybe like we could have a product here that would automatically ingest conversations and improve them with empathy, whether it be a bot, whether it be an email. So I left and decided in the pandemic, I'm going to like found my own company. On a personal level as well, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And at that time in the pandemic, we were not, if you put someone into memory care, it was a complete lockdown situation. So I actually moved both of my parents into my house. And I kind of came to the realization that like, I couldn't work for someone else if I had two children under the age of 5 that were doing remote school. It was like a crazy time for parents and for caregivers.
Oh my goodness. I really empathize with anybody who had
Yes.
kids 6 or under during the pandemic, just
Yeah.
very, very tough. And then you had your parents as well.
Yes. And many people would be like, oh, well, maybe this isn't the time to found a business.
Great time to start a company. Yeah, absolutely.
But for me, I was like, I can't work for anyone else other than myself right now because I need to have, speaking of empathy, like this total radical understanding of the fact that my work schedule might be from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. And like, because I need to be focusing on the things at hand here, which is my family.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, great, I learned this, understood all of this from other commercial spaces. I'm going to make my own training data set and my own algorithms here to do this. I started out with this game called Empathy Rocks, which is a way for therapists, coaches, actually really anyone to learn to listen with empathy. We teach them a couple of skills and then they play this game. They rank each other's responses as empathic or not. They are actually responding to people that are seeking advice that have posted on anonymous forums on the internet. They respond to those with empathy. Okay. They get rankings. And that kind of created, and they get continuing education credits for playing if they are a provider or a coach. So they get the benefit of that. And we get the benefit of learning about how all of these people across the world are responding with empathy.
And really interesting cultural differences as well, I would have thought.
Exactly. So I was really, with the caveat that everything was in English, I was really interested in not having my training data for the algorithms come from one group. Like I didn't want one set of undergrad students in middle America to be the training data because it's got problems for applications. So I was like, let's get this robust, to have thousands of people playing these games. And that went in and formed the basis of empathic. And then empathic trained on that data and then was able to immediately identify these skills in other conversations and correct them. And then we started to apply it, empathic, this kind of Grammarly for empathy thing, in all sorts of different settings. So for insurance claims, for manager-employee feedback, in consumer goods companies.
So give me an example in terms of insurance claim, how a conversation might go.
So it's interesting because in insurance claims, it's actually a perfect use case for us because those interactions need to be highly empathic to promote retention and loyalty to the insurance companies because they're typically like crisis situations or near crisis when people are calling to make a claim. So like they just had a car accident or a flood or a thing. And even though the point of the agent isn't to provide this highly empathic support, if they do, there's some research to show that like people feel, more understood and are less likely to, get upset or leave the company or even drive higher claim costs because they're like, oh, this person gets me. I'm feeling psychologically held in this moment. So an example of a call that we that processed through our algorithm that was like non-empathic is like someone that had their car in a parking lot where it was damaged by hail. And like, they're not upset and they're calling and they're like, hey, I need to make a claim. I had hail damage. And the agent goes like, how many people were injured in your accident? Like, what was the damage? And the person's like, what? Are you even listening to me? Like, no, I did not have a car accident. So like those little moments have huge impact. And in fact, we found that I think there's this crazy statistic, like I need to pull it up, but it's like 80% of consumers leave after one bad interaction like that because it's just like, it's so profound to feel like, oh my gosh, that you had one job and like you didn't do, like, I don't want to continue this relationship. So for us to have this accurate listening and to have a real-time like detection of like, what were the skills or who are your top performers in claims that really listen with empathy? What do they do? Here are the skills they use. And like, here are the people that need to improve. And like, rather than using this like a panopticon of like, here's your good performers and your bad performers, we have this real-time correction tool so that if something like that starts to happen, empathic can come along and be like, hey, let's rephrase it.
How does it do the nudging? Am I on a call with you? You've called in, I'm in some kind of customer service situation, and I've said something, and then the algorithm is saying it in my ear, or it's popping up on a message board on my screen so that I'm in real time given some new words to say?
So we can detect and serve up immediate corrections in voice. We haven't yet had any users that want to use it in that way. I think because it is so disjointed to be like, oh, I said something bad and now here's my like suggestions. So most of our users will do something beforehand where, like, for example, in chat augmented, or like if there's a script, they'll place that into the correction and they'll see the options for how they should correct it. Or if it's after the fact, they can have options for repairing that. So for example, like if we have let's say a manager that's talking to an employee, or maybe an employee talking to a manager saying, you're the worst manager ever. We would say, hey, why don't you know, something like that, where it's like, it's already out of the gate. Like, it's too bad. We would have the empathic would detect that. It would say, ooh, that's a confrontation. Like, that's not good. And it would immediately say, hey, you said something that had like a lot of impact. Here's like what to do now. Use an I statement to say, I need more support with X. And like, it would automatically correct it right as that's happening. So we're seeing a lot of implementations for manager feedback, employee feedback. Again, you need that moment of sending. If you want to truly prevent, you have to send it to the algorithm before you say it. But we have this kind of right after the fact correction as well to kind of mitigate those things.
Okay, so this is very interesting. Getting me from A to Z is a process. Incremental change in the right direction versus actually giving me the perfect response. You can give me the words, but I won't necessarily understand it at all because it's so different from what I said. How do you supply that additional understanding so that I can get to a place where I understand why I'm saying that and not launching into confrontational dialogue or monologue, perhaps?
We haven't released this yet, but one of our new features in development is actually going to be looking at kind of these skills longitudinally and over time to notice trends and like what people are doing and in their behaviors, and then actually direct them to some form of learning or continuing education for those skills. We believe, and I believe that based on my training, that the best thing is in the moment correction for actually like having that moment of like, oh, I need to pause, like, and maybe you don't take the suggestion either. Like you might not just be like, oh, never mind, here's my I statement. You might just be like, oh, an AI, an objective computer noticed that what I said was problematic. And you know, the example of like my manager is horrible is probably an extreme, because you would hope someone would know that was not okay. But we have smaller things like, did you finish your presentation yet? It's like, you know, rather than like, hey, I want to check in on the timeline for your conversation. So,
how's it going? Do you have any issues?
We basically are telling the user, like, you've had something's been detected there that you need to pause on. Here's our suggestions. Here's the skills we suggest. But it may be that people get the correction and say, like, I don't want any of these, but I've noticed this and I'm going to try a different tactic. It may also be that, like you said, the gap is too big and they may need additional coaching. So again, we're looking at like, could we triage to continuing education to really help people deeply understand this, like if they're not connecting the dots. And then we're also exploring, which is like a fascinating idea to me. And it's very, we haven't done this yet, but we're starting an alpha project of having people direct to actual human coaches. Like if it seems that the AI is, you know, it's giving you the suggestions over and over again, you're not getting it, you're not integrating it, you need a coach.
Yeah, want to understand why, then find out more here. Yeah, I think that's great.
Because our goal isn't to replace the human interactions. It's just to be able to give you this feedback that is objective, that's timely. And right now is the only time in history, because of the way computing processes have gone, that we can actually do this at scale. So when I first released these models and like, you know, with our team in 2009, every time we uploaded a recording, it would take like 6 hours to process an hour of video to like give the feedback, because that was the computing power and that was the internet and all this stuff. And now we can run these huge models at scale, get generative language feedback, like all of this stuff can happen within fractions of a second So we're almost at this, like some of the questions you're asking are kind of unknown. Like we don't know how people will respond to instant empathy feedback until we can have people, evaluate these outcomes at scale. So we're here and we're trying to understand that.
And it's very powerful, and it couldn't be a more important time. I kind of discovered empathy as being the solution for lots of different things as we're moving into the future of work in terms of needing a more human-centric understanding, the balance of talent and technology, and how we need to be working more closely together. And of course, we've got all these mental health issues, which have only been exacerbated by the pandemic, existed prior to, but are worse now and lingering. And as Gen Z is coming into the workplace, obviously the workplace is having to try and adjust for that. In addition to helping customer service and HR and recruiting, the type of services that you're currently offering, in terms of internal conversations, is the algorithm able to read texts and emails and stuff like that and be giving suggestions in there too?
Right. So we are currently a B2B company, which means, or like B2B to C, which means that like an HR SaaS platform would integrate us so that their product could offer our algorithms there. So we don't yet have a direct consumer integration like a Slack integration or Chrome extension, things like that. That's on our roadmap. But right now...
yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, and I think that's what everyone wants. But for right now, we're integrating into like existing platforms. So let's just, take an HR SaaS platform like... BetterWorks or Culture Amp or Lattice or Workday, where you are providing feedback within that app. We would be auto-correcting it to improve the communications.
Right.
And we do actually have a Slack integration, and we do have some of these things, but they're not publicly available yet. We're trying to provide our integrations to businesses so that they can deploy them. And we also have large customers like Fortune 500 or 100 customers that will deploy these internally through integrations, but it's not available yet to the general public.
Because machine learning is so powerful and AI is so powerful to actually detect some of these alerts and signals and pauses and hesitations, which I'm always talking about, like decoding. This is the stuff that computers can do very well, that can be helping us when we're needing, I believe, to be really integrating and infusing empathy in our work lives so much more and supporting mental health. Going back for a second to the clinical situation, that being able to detect mental health issues before managers do, because they've actually detected signals, can be powerful and helpful in supporting employees. Grin, what haven't I asked you that I should have done? This has been absolutely fascinating, and I love what you're doing, where you're going, and there's so much more ahead.
There is, and I'm hoping that we will have a place where folks can go to our website and actually just put in some feedback and get some corrections so they can get a taste of what our tool is like. So hopefully next quarter we'll have that released so that any of your listeners can play with that. But what I would say is, a lot of people ask me, where do I start? How can I be more empathic? And you don't really actually need all these tools or fancy AI. I just tell people to start with simply seeing if you can repeat back what you heard when you're listening before you ask a question or provide advice. Can you restate that in a way where they have the reaction that's yes, that's it. That's exactly how I feel. You got it. Or of course, that's what I'm saying, or whatever. And I think that's the starting, the core starting place for improving your empathy over time is seeing if you can get accurate understanding before you jump into providing advice or assuming or things like that. And I have a whole bunch of blog articles on Medium where I'm here's 20 ways to ask permission before providing advice, or just simple skills that you can use. And the AI is great. It prevents things. It has a cathartic quality where you can kind of say what you want and it gets corrected. But in real life, you can learn these skills and apply them anywhere. And that's where I recommend that people kind of start in their journey towards this, is take a couple simple skills and see how it works for you to integrate those in your daily life.
And it's also fascinating because if I'm trying to say it back to you, what you've just said, I'll also use some of my own phrasing and language, which then is some interpretation of what you said. And then you can kind of go,
It is.
oh, no, that's not what I meant at all. And that's really important. I mean, that actually lends texture and context and everything to our conversation. So there's more understanding both ways, which I found fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that part. Yeah, exactly.
Grin, this has been absolutely delightful. I'm so thrilled to understand what you're doing and what you're developing and the machine learning power that we now have that can actually really speed up the data that you're gathering and the accuracy and the support that this kind of technology is going to be providing both now and in the future. So thank you so much for sharing with your insights.
No, thank you for inviting me. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you again so much to Dr. Grin Lord, founder and CEO of empathic.ai, mpathic.ai. You can find out more about her on LinkedIn and follow her on Twitter at Dr. Grin Lord, DRGRINLORD. Her blog is on Medium at grintherapy.medium.com. You can find out more about Grin's company at empathic.ai and on LinkedIn. Immediate action tip. If you want to be more empathetic, start with seeing if you can repeat back what you heard when you're listening before you ask a question or provide advice. You can restate what the person said so they say, yes, that's it, that's exactly how I feel. The core of empathy is to make sure you have an accurate understanding first. Thank you for listening. And I would like to listen to you too and find out what you have been enjoying most so far about this podcast. We're coming to the end of 2022, and the past couple of months have been challenging for executives, managers, and employees, all exploring and refining new ways of working while also navigating a challenging economic climate. So which episodes have been most helpful for you so far? Which were the most interesting? I have a great slate of interviews coming up to support and surprise you, and I'm also keen to find folks that could be particularly useful for you going forward, such as how to attract and retain Gen Z employees, or how to justify why hybrid is worth the effort. Please send a quick note or suggestion to us at contact@sophiewade.com. And if you're enjoying this, please don't forget to share a review on any of the podcast platforms. Until next time.